October 20th, 1944. Red Beach, Leyte, Philippines. The surf rolled in under a gray sky, thick with the smell of salt, oil, cordite, and wet canvas. Offshore, the horizon seemed made of steel. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, landing craft, and support vessels crowded the waters of Leyte Gulf until the sea itself appeared to have been conquered by the United States Navy. Guns still thundered from beyond the beach. Shells screamed inland toward Japanese positions hidden among palm groves, ridge lines, and muddy trails. Each explosion lifted black earth into the humid air. In the shallow water, American soldiers pushed forward through the surf with rifles held high. Men of the 6th Army stumbled under the weight of packs, ammunition belts, canteens, entrenching tools, and soaked uniforms. Landing craft ramps dropped with a slap of metal, and infantrymen poured out into waist-deep water. Some cursed as they sank into soft sand. Others stared toward the tree line, waiting for the flash of enemy fire. Above them, aircraft circled like hunting birds. Navy fighters guarded the sky while bombers and attack planes struck Japanese targets farther inland. The invasion had begun not as a raid, not as a symbolic gesture, but as the opening blow in the liberation of the Philippines. For Japan, the islands were a shield across the southern resource routes. Oil from the Indies, rubber, tin, food, and raw materials flowed through these waters toward the Japanese home islands. For America, Leyte was the doorway. Break it open, and Japan's empire would begin to split apart. But for one man stepping carefully through the surf, Leyte was more than a target on a map. General Douglas MacArthur stood tall even as the water tugged at his uniform trousers. He wore his familiar crushed service cap, khaki shirt, open collar, and sunglasses. His corn-cob pipe was close at hand, already part of the image America knew. Around him moved officers, photographers, aides, and soldiers, all aware that they were witnessing a moment that had been building for more than 2.5 years. MacArthur had left the Philippines in March 1942, ordered by President Franklin Roosevelt to escape the collapsing American and Filipino defense of Bataan and Corregidor. He had not wanted to leave. Behind him remained starving soldiers, nurses, civilians, and prisoners who would soon face death marches, camps, disease, hunger, and cruelty. Before departing for Australia, he had made a vow that became one of the most famous promises of the war. I shall return, now, on this beach. That promise had become flesh, water, mud, and gunfire. A landing craft rocked behind him. The surf slapped against his legs. Nearby, Lieutenant General Richard Sutherland and other staff officers moved cautiously forward. Filipino officials came ashore too, including President Sergio Osmeña, who had lived in exile while his nation suffered under occupation. The beach was not fully safe. Japanese resistance inland remained dangerous, and the campaign had only begun. Yet MacArthur understood the power of the moment. He knew armies needed supplies, ships, and plans. He also knew nations needed words. A radio microphone waited. The general stood near the shoreline, facing not only the men around him, but millions he could not see. Across the islands, Filipinos had endured years of military rule. Shortages, executions, forced labor, guerrilla warfare, and fear. In the hills and jungles, resistance fighters had kept fighting with stolen rifles, hidden radios, and homemade intelligence networks. In towns and villages, families whispered rumors of an American return, wondering if the promise had survived the long years of war. MacArthur's voice carried with deliberate force. People of the Philippines, I have returned. The words moved beyond the beach. They were not shouted in panic. They were pronounced like a verdict. He continued, calling on the people to rise, to strike and to join the advancing forces. He spoke as commander, liberator, and symbol. But the line that endured was simple enough for every soldier, sailor, guerrilla, and civilian to remember. I have returned. Behind those words, the largest naval battle of the war was beginning to take shape. Japanese commanders knew Leyte could not be ignored. If the Americans secured the Philippines, Japan's lifeline to Southeast Asia would be strangled. The Imperial Japanese Navy prepared to gamble nearly everything. Its remaining battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and carriers would converge on Leyte Gulf in a desperate attempt to smash the invasion fleet. For the men on the beach, that danger was still over the horizon. For the admirals at sea, it was already coming. October 22nd, 1944, Brunei Bay, Borneo. In the heavy tropical heat, the ships of the Imperial Japanese Navy raised steam and prepared to move. Their gray hulls sat beneath a low sky, patched with rust, salt, and scars from a war that had turned against them. Once, Japanese carrier groups had crossed the Pacific with confidence, striking Pearl Harbor, sweeping through Southeast Asia, and threatening Australia. Now the fleet gathered not for conquest, but for one desperate counterstroke. The Americans had landed on Leyte. That single fact forced the Japanese High Command into action, in Tokyo and aboard fleet headquarters. The problem was brutally clear. If the Philippines fell, the sea lanes between Japan and the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies would be cut. Without oil, ships could not sail, aircraft could not train, tanks could not move, and factories would choke. The empire's outer defenses would become useless islands, isolated and starving. Leyte was not merely another battlefield. It was the hinge on which Japan's ability to continue the war might turn. The Japanese answer was Operation Shogo, the victory operation. It was bold, complicated, and terribly risky. The plan called for several separate naval forces to converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions. Their mission was to break through the American screen, enter the Gulf, and destroy the transports and supply ships supporting MacArthur's invasion force. If the soldiers on Leyte could be cut off, the landing might collapse before it became a true liberation campaign. The strongest Japanese force was commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. His center force carried some of the most powerful surface ships still available to Japan. Among them were the gigantic battleships Yamato and Musashi, the largest battleships ever built. Floating fortresses armed with massive 18.1-inch guns. Their turrets seemed less like naval weapons than industrial monuments. Each shell weighed more than a small automobile. Around them moved cruisers and destroyers, leaner and faster, armed with torpedoes that American sailors had learned to fear. Kurita's force would sail from Brunei, move through the Sibuyan Sea, pass San Bernardino Strait, and descend upon Leyte Gulf from the north. To the south, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura would lead another force through Surigao Strait. His ships included older battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Vice Admiral Kyo Hideshima would follow with a separate group, also heading toward the same narrow passage. Their route would bring them into a deadly corridor between islands, a place where American commanders could turn geography into a trap. Farther north, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the carrier force. But Japan's carriers were no longer the weapon they had been in 1941 and 1942. Many of their best pilots were dead. Fuel shortages limited training. Aircraft numbers were thin. Ozawa's carriers were intended not as the killing arm of the operation, but as bait. Their purpose was to lure Admiral William F. Halsey's powerful American Third Fleet away from Leyte, opening the door for Kurita's battleships to strike the landing area. It was a plan built on sacrifice. It required timing, deception, courage, and luck. On the American side, Command was divided between great fleets and strong personalities. General MacArthur commanded the Southwest Pacific forces, and his invasion army depended on naval protection. Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid's 7th Fleet supported the landings directly. His older battleships, escort carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and smaller ships guarded Leyte Gulf and supplied the soldiers ashore. Farther out, Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet ranged with fast carriers and modern battleships, hunting Japanese naval forces and striking from the air. The arrangement was powerful, but not simple. 2 American fleets operated near the same battle area under different command chains. Messages passed through channels, assumptions hardened into decisions, and in the vast confusion of sea war, a gap could open between what one commander meant and what another commander believed. Japan hoped to drive its remaining strength into that gap. Kurita's ships left Brunei and pushed into the open sea. Sailors moved across steel decks darkened by spray. Engine rooms roared below the waterline. Lookouts searched the horizon. Officers studied charts of channels, islands, reefs, and straits. They knew American submarines prowled the approaches. They knew American aircraft dominated daylight. They also knew that turning back would mean accepting the slow strangulation of the empire. Before the main battle had even begun, the sea claimed its first victims. American submarines Darter and Dace found Kurita's force in the Palawan Passage. In the darkness before dawn, they slipped into attack position. Torpedoes surged through the water toward the Japanese columns. Heavy cruiser Otago, Kurita's flagship, was struck and began to sink. Cruiser Maya was also hit and destroyed. Cruiser Takao was badly damaged. Men tumbled into oil-stained water. Alarm bells rang through shattered compartments. Kurita himself was forced into the sea and later rescued, shaken but alive. The blow was severe, but the center force continued. As the sun rose over the Philippine waters, American search planes and submarines had already torn at the edges of the Japanese plan. Yet the great battleships still came on. Yamato and Musashi moved through the sea with grim momentum. Their crews understood that the Americans were waiting somewhere ahead. They also understood that Leyte lay beyond the straits, where landing ships, supply vessels, and transports fed MacArthur's return. On shore, soldiers dug into the wet ground and pushed inland. At sea, the greatest naval clash of the Pacific War was beginning to unfold. October 24th, 1944. Sibuyan Sea, Central Philippines. Morning came hot and bright over the water, and with it came the first American aircraft, high above the Japanese center force. Pilots from Halsey's fast carriers sighted the long gray columns cutting through the Sibuyan Sea. From that altitude, even the largest battleships looked like dark shapes sliding across blue glass. But the pilots knew what they were seeing. This was no minor convoy. This was the heart of Japan's surface fleet, moving toward San Bernardino Strait, and beyond that, toward Leyte. The alarm moved quickly through the American fleet. On carrier flight decks, crews ran beneath spinning propellers. Ordnance men rolled bombs into place. Torpedoes were lifted, secured, checked, and checked again. Pilots climbed into cockpits slick with heat and oil. Engines coughed, caught, and roared. Signal flags snapped in the wind. One by one, fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers launched into the sky, rising from the decks of the American fast carriers and forming into attack groups. Their target was impossible to miss. Musashi, sister ship of Yamato, was a mountain of armor and steel. Her hull displaced more than 70,000 tons when fully loaded. Her main guns could throw shells farther than many men could imagine. Around her steamed cruisers and destroyers, weaving, watching, preparing their anti-aircraft batteries. The Japanese sailors aboard her had drilled for this moment. They knew American aircraft would come in waves. They knew the ship's armor was thick. They also knew that in this war, Aircraft had already humbled battleships many times before. The first wave descended. American dive bombers rolled over and dropped almost vertically, their engines screaming as they plunged through bursts of black flak. Tracer fire rose toward them in red and orange streams. The sky around Musashi became a violent web of shell bursts, smoke, and flying metal. Bombs fell, striking near misses that lifted towering columns of water. Others hit steel. Shock traveled through decks and bulkheads. Men were thrown against ladders, gun shields, and machinery. Then came the torpedo planes. They came low, so low that spray seemed to reach for their wings. Japanese guns swung down, firing furiously. Some aircraft staggered through smoke with holes torn in their wings. Others pressed forward. Torpedoes dropped and ran beneath the surface, leaving pale tracks toward Musashi's broad hull. Impacts slammed into her side. Deep inside the battleship, water burst through ruptured plating. Pumps strained. Damage control parties moved through darkness, steam, and flooding compartments. Officers counter-flooded to correct the growing list, deliberately letting water into the opposite side to keep the ship upright. Musashi kept moving, but each hit stole speed, stability, and life. Kurita's force turned and twisted beneath the attacks. Yamato fired her anti-aircraft guns. Cruisers threw up curtains of fire. Destroyers tried to shield the heavier ships, yet the American aircraft kept returning. Wave after wave crossed the sky from different carriers, each group adding bombs, torpedoes, near misses to the punishment. By afternoon, Musashi was dying. Her bow rode low. Her speed fell. Water poured into her wounds faster than crews could control it. Men labored below decks in air thick with oil fumes, smoke, and heat. Some compartments became tombs when hatches were sealed to save the ship. Above, gunners continued firing until their mounts were shattered or ammunition was gone. The great battleship absorbed punishment that would have sunk smaller ships many times over, but there was a limit even to Musashi's strength. Near sunset, she rolled farther. The order to abandon ship came too late for many. Sailors jumped from the listing hull into the sea. Some clung to wreckage. Others were pulled down by suction, oil-soaked clothing, or exhaustion. The massive ship that had been built to dominate a decisive surface battle never fired her great guns at an enemy battleship. Instead, she sank under the repeated blows of carrier aircraft, a symbol of how the war at sea had changed. Musashi disappeared beneath the Sibuyan Sea. The Americans believed they had broken Kurita. From the air, it seemed reasonable. His force had been struck hard. One of the largest battleships in history was gone. Other ships had taken damage. Kurita turned west for a time, appearing to retreat. Reports passed through American command channels, mixing certainty with assumption. To many watching the battle from plotting rooms and flag bridges, the danger from the center force seemed reduced, perhaps even defeated. But Kurita had not abandoned the mission. After withdrawing temporarily, he turned east again. His remaining ships, including Yamato, still had enough strength to continue. As darkness spread across the Sibuyan Sea, the Japanese center force resumed its approach to San Bernardino Strait. The path ahead was dangerous, but it was also open. At the same time, far to the north, Ozawa's carrier force was finally being sighted. This was the bait Japan had prepared. Empty decks or nearly empty decks, carriers without enough aircraft to strike with real power, but still carriers. To Admiral Halsey, whose fast carriers had spent the war hunting the remnants of Japanese naval aviation, they looked like the prize. Reports of Ozawa's force pulled attention northward. The chance to destroy Japan's remaining carriers seemed too important to ignore. The night deepened over the Philippine Sea. Kincaid's 7th Fleet remained near Leyte, guarding transports and supporting MacArthur's soldiers ashore. Halsey's Third Fleet looked north toward Ozawa. Kurita's battered but dangerous force pushed toward San Bernardino Strait. And in that darkness, the door to Leyte Gulf began to open. October 25th, 1944. Surigao Strait. Southern approach to Leyte Gulf. The night was black, narrow, and waiting between the islands. Surigao Strait stretched like a trap laid by geography itself. Dark hills rose on either side. The water below them carried the movement of ships no man could easily see. Radar screens glowed in American combat information centers. Signal lamps were hooded. Guns were loaded. Torpedoes were ready in their tubes. The men of the 7th Fleet listened to the beat of engines through steel hulls and waited for the Japanese Southern Force to appear. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura came first. His force moved north in column, driving toward Leyte Gulf with old battleships, a cruiser, and destroyers. The route was dangerous, but the mission allowed no hesitation. Nishimura's ships were meant to break through the strait and strike the invasion anchorage. Somewhere beyond the darkness lay the American transports, supply vessels, landing craft, and the fragile lifeline feeding MacArthur's soldiers ashore. If those ships could be destroyed, the land battle on Leyte might change in a single night. But the Americans knew he was coming. Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf had arranged his force with cold precision. Patrol torpedo boats waited farthest south, small wooden craft with brave crews and limited protection. Behind them were destroyers, ready for torpedo attacks. Farther north, cruisers and battleships formed a battle line across the top of the strait. Many of those battleships had been sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor, then raised, repaired, rebuilt, and returned to war. Now they waited in the darkness for a chance to answer the opening blow of December 1941. West Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, Tennessee, California, Pennsylvania. Their names carried memory. Their guns carried revenge. The first attacks came from the small boats. PT boats slipped across the black water, engines growling as they tried to close on the Japanese column. Spray slapped their hulls. Tracers flashed, searchlights flickered and vanished. The torpedo boats attacked with courage, but their blows did not stop Nishimura. They did something else just as important. They reported, harassed, confused, and marked the enemy's progress. The Japanese were moving deeper into the American trap. Then the destroyers went in. American destroyers advanced from both sides of the strait, using darkness and radar to find their firing positions. Torpedo officers leaned over instruments. Captains watched bearings and ranges change second by second. At the right moment, orders snapped through voice tubes and sound-powered phones. Fire torpedoes. The weapons dropped, surged, and vanished beneath the surface. Minutes later, explosions tore through the Japanese column. Destroyers were hit. The battleship Fuso was struck and began to break apart in the night. Flames rose from damaged ships, painting the water in orange light. Men aboard Japanese vessels struggled through smoke. Ruptured steam lines and flooding compartments. Formation dissolved. Orders became difficult to send and harder to obey. The strait that had seemed like a route into Leyte Gulf now became a corridor of death. Still, Nishimura pressed north. His flagship, battleship Yamashiro, continued toward the American line. She had already taken damage, but she kept coming, her guns seeking targets in the darkness. Nearby, the heavy cruiser Mogami struggled on, battered but not yet finished. Survivors from crippled ships fought fire, abandoned stations, or clung to wreckage as the main battle moved past them. At the head of the strait, Oldendorf's battle line waited. American radar had the range. On the battleships, turret crews stood inside great rotating steel chambers, surrounded by powder bags, shells, hydraulic machinery, and the smell of grease. Fire control teams tracked the enemy by radar, not by sight. The Japanese ships were still difficult to see with human eyes, but on the screens and plotting tables, their movement was clear enough. Oldendorf had achieved the classic naval maneuver every surface commander understood, and every enemy feared. He had crossed the T. The American battle line lay across Nishimura's path, able to fire broadside after broadside. The Japanese could reply only with their forward guns as they approached. The order came. American battleships opened fire. The night exploded. 14-inch and 16-inch guns hurled shells across the strait. The concussion rolled through the ships like thunder trapped inside steel. Flame burst from muzzles. Smoke swept along the decks. Cruisers joined in, their guns firing rapidly, filling the darkness with more shells. The water around Yamashiro erupted as salvos landed. Shells struck her armor, superstructure, and upper works. Fires spread. Metal peeled back. Men were killed at their stations before they could understand what had hit them. Yamashiro fought on, but she was surrounded by gunfire. Her crew tried to return fire. Her remaining guns roared into the night, but the American line had distance, radar, position, and numbers. Salvos hammered her again and again. Torpedoes and shells completed what the trap had begun. At last, Yamashiro slowed, burned, and began to sink. Nishimura went down with his flagship. Behind him, Shima's following force entered confusion and disaster, coming up the same route. Shima found wreckage, fire, and broken ships in the water. His ships had little chance to understand the full situation. Mogami, crippled and burning, became a hazard in the darkness. Collisions, evasive movements, and uncertainty spread through the Japanese southern attack. The coordinated thrust through Surigao Strait had failed. For the Americans, it was a crushing victory. For naval history, it was something even larger. Surigao Strait became the last battleship against battleship action ever fought. The great gun line, imagined by admirals for generations, had appeared one final time in the night waters of the Philippines. Old battleships, resurrected from Pearl Harbor, had destroyed a Japanese force trying to reach MacArthur's beachhead. Yet the victory in the south did not end the danger. At dawn, the men guarding Leyte Gulf looked north and east toward waters that should have been protected. They believed Halsey's powerful fleet was covering San Bernardino Strait. They believed the Japanese center force had been turned away or broken. But through the night, Kurita had passed the strait. His battleships and cruisers emerged into the open water off Samar, where only a small American escort carrier group stood between him and the invasion fleet. The men aboard those escort carriers were not prepared to face Yamato. Their ships were slow, lightly armored, and built to support troops ashore, not to trade blows with battleships. Morning light spread across the sea. Lookouts stared at shapes on the horizon. Then came the first terrifying report. Japanese battleships and cruisers were closing fast. October 25th, 1944. Off Samar, east of Leyte. The first shells fell like mountains thrown from the horizon. They did not whistle like ordinary artillery. They came from so far away that the men aboard the American escort carriers saw towering geysers rise from the sea before they fully understood what was happening. Columns of water climbed hundreds of feet into the morning air. White at the base, gray at the top, mixed with smoke and the ugly stain of dye from Japanese spotting shells. The ocean around the small carriers seemed to erupt in colored fountains. This was Taffy 3. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's escort carrier group had been assigned to support the landings on Leyte, not fight a surface battle against the strongest Japanese ships still afloat. His carriers were small, slow, and thin-skinned. Their flight decks carried aircraft meant for ground attack, anti-submarine patrol, and close support. They did not have the armor or speed of Halsey's fast carriers. Their escorts were destroyers and destroyer escorts. Ship sailors called tin cans because they seemed so fragile beside battleships. Now Taffy 3 faced Kurita's center force. Yamato was there, her massive guns reaching across the sea. Heavy cruisers and destroyers came with her, closing at high speed. The Japanese had broken through San Bernardino Strait and stumbled upon the vulnerable flank of the American invasion support force. Beyond Taffy 3 lay the transports, supply ships, landing craft, and the entire machinery that kept MacArthur's return alive. Sprague acted at once. He ordered his carriers to turn east, run for rain squalls, and launch every aircraft they could put into the air. Flight deck crews moved with desperate speed. Planes took off armed with whatever was available. Some carried bombs, some carried depth charges, some had rockets or machine guns. Others lifted into the sky with little more than the hope that an aircraft diving at a warship might make Japanese gunners flinch. Then the escorts turned to fight. Commander Ernest Evans of USS. Johnston did not wait for perfect orders. Johnston was a destroyer, fast and lightly armored, armed with 5-inch guns and torpedoes. Against Japanese battleships and heavy cruisers, she was terribly outmatched. Evans understood that. His crew understood it too. But the choice was not between victory and defeat. The choice was between delaying the Japanese and allowing them to slaughter the carriers. Johnston charged. She raced through shell splashes toward the Japanese line, laying smoke and firing as she went. Her 5-inch guns opened on much larger targets. Inside her gun mounts, sailors loaded and fired with frantic rhythm. The ship shook from her own weapons and from near misses that battered the sea around her. Evans drove closer until torpedo range became possible. Torpedoes left Johnston and ran toward the heavy cruiser Kumano. A hit tore into the Japanese cruiser and blew off her bow. It was an astonishing wound delivered by a ship that should not have survived long enough to strike. Johnston then turned under furious fire. Shells hit her. One burst tore through the bridge area and wounded Evans. Smoke filled compartments. Men died at their posts. Steering was damaged. Communications failed. Yet Johnston kept fighting. She was not alone. USS Howell charged too, firing guns and launching torpedoes against ships many times her size. USS Hermann followed with equal ferocity, closing through splashes and smoke. Destroyer escorts such as Samuel B. Roberts joined the attack, though they were even smaller and more lightly armed. Samuel B. Roberts was not built for this kind of battle. She was built to guard convoys and hunt submarines. But that morning, she fought like a cruiser. The American ships made smoke screens, darted in and out of cover, fired torpedoes, and forced Kurita's formation to maneuver. Every turn cost the Japanese team. Every torpedo track created doubt. Every smoke cloud hid the carriers for another minute. The sea became a chaos of rain squalls, burning ships, shell splashes, radio calls, and aircraft diving again and again above the battle. American pilots attacked with anything they had. Some aircraft made dry runs after their ammunition was gone, diving without bombs to distract Japanese gunners. Others strafed bridges and decks with machine guns. Pilots who had expected to support troops in jungles found themselves attacking battleships with courage and improvisation. Their repeated attacks made Kurita believe he faced a stronger carrier force than he actually did. On the escort carriers, the situation was terrifying. Ships like Gambier Bay, Fanshawe Bay, Kalinin Bay, White Plains, Kitkun Bay, Ain Saint. Low struggled to escape. Their engines could not give them enough speed. Their thin hulls could not absorb heavy shells. Sailors pushed aircraft overboard when necessary, fought fires, passed ammunition, and watched the horizon flash with enemy gunfire. Gambier Bay was hit repeatedly. Japanese shells tore into her, flooding spaces and killing men. She slowed, listed, and finally sank, the only American aircraft carrier sunk by naval gunfire during the war. Still, Taffy 3 refused to collapse. Hull was battered to death. Samuel B. Roberts was struck again and again until she could no longer survive. Johnston, already crippled, fought until Japanese fire overwhelmed her. Survivors later remembered enemy officers saluting the sinking destroyer as she went down. Whether every detail of that memory was seen clearly through smoke and terror, the meaning endured. Johnston and the other small ships had done something extraordinary. They had charged a battle fleet and made it hesitate. That hesitation changed the battle. Kurita saw aircraft attacking, destroyers charging, torpedoes in the water, and smoke hiding the American carriers. His ships were scattered after repeated evasive maneuvers. He had lost time and cohesion. He did not know exactly what lay ahead. He did not realize how close he was to the vulnerable invasion shipping in Leyte Gulf. Reports were confused. Damage was mounting. His mission was to destroy the landing force, but the battlefield no longer looked like a clear path to victory. Then came the decision that stunned both sides. Kurita turned away. The Japanese center force withdrew from the waters off Samar, the road to Leyte Gulf, which had opened in darkness, closed again under the pressure of small ships, carrier aircraft, smoke, confusion, and raw courage. For the Americans, the cost had been severe. Ships were sunk, crews were lost. Men floated in the water for hours under the burning sun, covered in oil, watching for sharks, praying for rescue. Yet the invasion fleet survived. MacArthur's soldiers on Leyte still had their supplies, their reinforcements, and their path inland. But even as Kurita withdrew, a new terror appeared from the sky. Near midday, Japanese aircraft approached the escort carriers. These were not ordinary bombing runs. Some pilots came in with no intention of returning. One plane dove toward St. Lo and struck her flight deck. Fire flashed. Explosions ripped through the carrier as bombs and ammunition detonated inside. Smoke and flame swallowed the ship. St. Lo sank, becoming one of the first major victims of the organized kamikaze attacks that would haunt the rest of the Pacific War. The Battle of Samar had been won, but not cleanly, not easily, and not without warning. Japan's surface fleet had failed to break the Leyte invasion. Yet Japan had revealed another weapon, one born of desperation and sacrifice. The war was moving into a darker stage. American sailors had seen that the enemy might now turn aircraft, pilots, and death itself into a guided weapon. Off Leyte, the sea still burned. Ashore, MacArthur's return continued, and far to the north, Halsey's carriers were closing on Ozawa's Bait, finishing another part of the largest naval battle of the Second World War. October 25th, 1944, Cape Engano, north of Luzon. The northern horizon belonged to aircraft. Admiral William F. Halsey's fast carriers had raced after Ozawa's force through the night, leaving San Bernardino Strait uncovered in the belief that Kurita's center force had been beaten and that the Japanese carriers to the north were the greater prize. Now, as dawn spread over the Philippine Sea, American pilots climbed from flight decks into the pale light, searching for the last carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy. They found them. Ozawa's ships were exposed, underpowered, and desperately short of aircraft. His carriers still had the shape of danger, still carried the names and silhouettes that stirred every American memory of Pearl Harbor, Coral Sea, Midway, and the long carrier war across the Pacific. But they were no longer the spearhead Japan had once wielded. They were bait, and the bait had worked. Halsey had taken the full strength of the Third Fleet northward. Now Ozawa had to pay the price. American dive bombers and torpedo planes came down through clouds and sunlight. Fighters swept ahead, searching for defending aircraft that barely existed in meaningful numbers. Anti-aircraft fire rose from Japanese decks, but it could not build the thick shield once provided by veteran pilots and coordinated air groups. Bombs struck flight decks. Torpedoes ran into hulls. Fires spread across hangars and elevators. Ships that had been sent to lure the Americans away now absorbed the fury of the carrier force they had drawn north. Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack force, came under repeated assault. Her crew fought fires, handled wounded men, and tried to keep the ship alive as explosions tore through her. Signal flags rose on her mast. Men gathered on deck as the list increased. The carrier that had helped open Japan's Pacific War now sank during the battle that marked the collapse of Japan's fleet as a decisive weapon. Other carriers followed. Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda were hit, crippled, and lost. Cruisers and destroyers tried to escape or rescue survivors, but American aircraft kept coming. The northern action was a victory for Halsey's carriers, and in another battle, under different conditions, it might have been the central triumph of the day. But while the Japanese carriers died off Cape Engano, the messages from the south carried anxiety, anger, and confusion. Taffy 3 had been under attack. Escort carriers and destroyers had fought for survival off Samar. Kincaid had called for help. His ships near Leyte believed the northern entrance had been guarded by Halsey's battleships. Halsey believed his intentions had been understood differently. Across command rooms and radio circuits, the battle exposed how even overwhelming power could be strained by distance, assumption, and the speed of events. One message from Admiral Chester Nimitz in Hawaii cut through the traffic with a phrase that would become famous for its sting. It asked where Task Force 34 was. Due to padding words added for encryption, the message arrived with an accidental poetic bite. The world wonders. Halsey was furious when he read it, but anger could not change the fact that for a few terrible hours, Kurita had been closer to Leyte Gulf than anyone in the American High Command had wanted to believe. By then, the decisive moment had already passed. Kurita was withdrawing. Nishimura's force had been destroyed in Surigao Strait. Shima had turned back. Ozawa's carriers were being sunk in the north. The Japanese plan had failed in every direction, even though it had come frighteningly close to disaster for the Americans off Samar. The Imperial Japanese Navy had committed its remaining strength to stop MacArthur's return, and it had not stopped it. The cost was staggering. Japanese losses included battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, aircraft, and thousands of sailors. More than the numbers. Japan lost the ability to challenge American sea power in a major fleet action. After Leyte Gulf, Japanese ships could still fight, still kill, still appear in desperate missions. But the Navy that had once swept across the Pacific could no longer decide the course of the war. For the United States and its allies, victory at Leyte Gulf secured the sea around the invasion. It protected the beachhead. It preserved the supply line. It allowed troops to continue pushing through mud, jungle, ridges, villages, and fields where Japanese defenders fought with the same stubbornness that had marked island after island across the Pacific. On Leyte, the land campaign remained brutal. Rain turned roads into rivers of brown sludge. Tanks bogged down. Trucks sank to their axles. Soldiers sweated through uniforms that never dried. Japanese troops used hills, ravines, and jungle cover to slow the advance. Filipino guerrillas guided American units through trails, identified enemy positions, carried messages, rescued downed airmen, and pointed the way through terrain that maps could not fully explain. Civilians emerged from hiding with cautious hope, some carrying small American flags saved through years of occupation. Others simply watching in silence as the sound of battle moved past their homes. MacArthur's words on the beach had not ended their suffering. They had begun the fight to end it. People of the Philippines, I have returned. The sentence traveled faster than any column of troops. It moved through radios, newspapers, military reports, and whispered conversations in occupied towns. For Americans, it fulfilled a vow made in defeat. For Filipinos, it carried the promise that the long night of occupation was breaking. For Japanese commanders, it confirmed that the American advance had reached the center of the empire's defensive line. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was not one single clash, but a storm of battles spread across vast waters. The Sibuyan Sea, where Musashi sank under waves of carrier aircraft. Surigao Strait, where old battleships crossed the T in the last great gun duel of its kind. Samar, where small ships charged giants and bought survival with blood. Cape Engano, where Japan's carrier force died as bait that had fulfilled its purpose, too late to save the operation. Together, these actions formed the largest naval battle of World War II. But beyond the scale, beyond the tonnage and the charts and the arrows drawn across maps, Leyte Gulf was about whether a promise could survive defeat, distance, and time. In 1942, MacArthur had left behind a country falling into enemy hands. In 1944, he returned with an army, a fleet, and a sentence sharpened by years of waiting. The camera of history often holds him in the surf, stepping through the water with officers around him, the shoreline ahead, and warships behind. It is an image carefully staged, but not empty. Symbols matter because people fight for more than positions on a map. They fight for home, memory, revenge, liberation, and the belief that abandonment is not always final. At Leyte, America returned to the Philippines. At Leyte Gulf, Japan tried to stop that return with the last great throw of its battle fleet, and when the smoke cleared across the straits and seas, the invasion still stood, the transports still unloaded, the soldiers still advanced, the guerrillas still guided them. The islands that Japan had seized were no longer beyond reach. MacArthur's famous promise had changed tense. Not "I shall return," but "I have returned."